Hello, this is Wade Frazier. This is April 28th, 2026, 11:09 a.m. This will continue my medical racket posts. My previous post dealt with the degenerative disease racket and some of the history of Western medicine. And those were really the primary focus of my original medical racket essay. But I also explored infectious disease somewhat. Um, but infectious disease wasn't an issue in my life, at least till 2020 and COVID. So when I was a child, I got the standard childhood diseases, measles, mumps, chickenpox. By the time I was 8 years old, I'd had all those. And there were no vaccines for them back then. And there were mild childhood diseases that nobody died from. Yeah. And so, in fact, the only vaccines I recall getting, I got a smallpox vaccine and diphtheria tetanus. Those were worthless. Yeah, those diseases had long since been conquered in the United States when I was a child. Yeah, the last smallpox death in the United States was, I think, back in the 1940s. And so nice. So the vaccines I got were worthless, but fortunately, there's only a few. Um, and I don't recall ever hearing about any child in my communities who died of infectious disease. It was a total non-issue when I was a child. And so, and that's probably one of the reasons why I really didn't focus on what I now know is an infectious disease racket. Infectious disease racket when there's really no infectious diseases that are, deadly. So, strange world. But again, it was relatively recently that happened. So my father actually had rheumatic fever as a child and missed a year of school. And so this is back in the 1940s. And so again, before the 1950s, there was still some. And again, a century ago, again, infectious disease was a big problem with civilization. And in fact, in my studies, um, it became evident that infectious disease was a scourge of civilizations throughout history. And yeah, so I mean, literally from the very early civilizations, there's evidence that there were epidemic diseases that swept through these cities, and civilizations uh, suffered, regularly. Like the Roman Empire had they had two big. Again, these are generational long epidemics that just thinned out the ranks of the Roman Empire. It was a big I forget, it was a big percentage of the Roman Empire that got wiped out by those. That's also helped its decline and fall. Was that, and then in the mid 1300s, you had the Black Death pandemic that swept through Eurasia, killed off maybe a third of Europe, this kind of thing. So those were those kind of thing. In fact, when the Europeans invaded the Western Hemisphere, the diseases they brought with them killed off tens of millions of natives. And in fact, it was the biggest death toll and the greatest genocide in history as an entire hemisphere was quickly depopulated in a little more than a century, with between a 75% and 95% decimation of the native population. And the English deliberately introduced smallpox to the Indians, smallpox blankets and stuff as they were being exterminated. So they knew enough about disease back then to know that you could give it to the Indians, kill them off, get their land, this kind of thing. And then my grandfather actually nearly died in the 1918 pandemic that swept Earth. He was there in the trenches in World War One and got it while he was in the trenches. And I've discussed this, written about it, where he thought he was going to die, so they threw him into a makeshift morgue there in the trenches, and then 3 days later he crawled out, freaked everybody out, but it crippled him. So he had rheumatoid arthritis from that experience. But eventually, he'd be an old man. But that was the last really pandemic the world had until COVID in 2020. And my original medical Racket essay dealt with Louis Pasteur's career. and he's credited with developing the germ theory of disease. But my studies showed me that there was a heck of a lot of myth making behind his image. Yeah, so Pasteur was a scoundrel who sought wealth and fame above all else. And his germ theory actually appears to be a partial plagiarism of a rival scientist, Antoine Béchamp. And in fact, I first encountered Béchamp when reading Christopher Bird's book on gas and the suns. This was good. This was the book that began me on my medical racket studies. So from the very beginning, I knew of this guy. And he was the first in a long line of scientists whose work really challenged orthodox ideas of microbiology. And in fact, Royal Rife and Gaston Sands, they also developed microscopes that had these so-called impossible resolutions. Yeah, optical theory can't explain how these microscopes can get the resolutions that they do. As they were able to watch processes happen at the microbiological level that today's microscopes can't see. As electron microscopes kill what they look at. So these guys are actually able to watch life processes at magnifications that even today scientists can't see. It's crazy. Yeah, their microscopes are still around. So it's off the reservation, forbidden avenues of research in microbiological research. In fact, this is in the quantum theory, etc. So again, quantum theory is what explains optical theory, and so like a lot of things, again, free energy and anti-gravity come out, a lot of physics is going to be overhauled. And it looks like optical theory is going to be part of that overhaul. Be my guess. In fact, in the 1930s, 20s, and 30s, Reich's microscopes were widely acknowledged to be the most powerful in the world. This is before electron microscopes. And he had scientists beating a path to his door around the world to look through his amazing microscope and see things that nobody else could. And then Rife, in fact, like Sands, both of them created non-toxic cancer cures that were an outcome of the research. That was one of the outcomes of the research, was coming up with disease treatments, and both of them had treatments that cured cancer. And then Morris Fishbein, so the scoundrel who I discussed in the previous video, who was a dictator of medicine for a generation, promoting asbestos cigarette filters and stuff. He tried to buy in to Rife's company, and when he was rebuffed, then he led a lawsuit that basically wiped out Rife. And again, it was typical suppression story, and so yeah, totally wiped Rife out. And yeah, so anyway, those are some of the things I dealt with in my original medical racket essay, and I dealt with vaccination in it. I did some. It wasn't a focus, but I wrote about it, and again, as an outcome of Pasteur's germ theory, and Pasteur was really the first great commercializer of vaccines. But the evidence is non-existent. That really vaccines had much to do with eradicating any disease. In fact, smallpox, the evidence is really thin that vaccines had anything to do with it. In fact, England began mandatory vaccination campaigns, and every time they'd have a mandatory vaccination campaign, they'd have these smallpox epidemics. Yeah, and then wherever they had the highest vaccination rates in places of the world for smallpox, where they also had the highest death rates from smallpox. Yeah, so smallpox only disappeared when people were no longer vaccinated much. And again, in fact, in my original medical racket essay, I wrote that the conquest of infectious disease had more to do with improvements in sanitation and nutrition, and also hygiene, than it did vaccines or any medical intervention, really. And so anyway, so in my original medical racket essay, I dealt with this a bit. In fact, crib death. So crib death was unknown before vaccination. And so, yeah, so crib death is really highly correlated with vaccination. And yeah, so there's really arguably no cases where vaccines actually conquer the disease, particularly deadly ones. And then the COVID vaccine hit, the COVID pandemic hit in 2020. And that really was a big wake-up call for me. And I didn't know there was a racket around infectious diseases. But I've since learned a lot about it, done a lot of study over the past several years. And so my original writings on the topic, they aged well. And this post will dig into some of what I've learned since then. Up front, I will state that I'm not in the no contagion and no virus camps on the fringes. So there are people who argue there's no such thing as contagion or no such thing as a virus. I don't buy that. I'm willing, I'm willing to be convinced, but I've read a bit of their work. It has not persuaded me. In fact, some of the work's appallingly bad. In fact, one of the ones who argued for no contagion, I ran into her work years before when they attacked vegetarians, which was like it was crazy attack on vegetarians. And so same person wrote a book about there's no contagion, and yeah, bogus. But again, really misrepresentation of the science, et cetera. There's no such thing as contagion. However, I do think that immunity is poorly understood in orthodoxy. And so I think again in the fifth epoch there's going to be a radical overhaul, I think, of a lot of that, infectious disease and viruses and this kind of stuff. There's a lot more going on than Orthodox medicine would have us believe. That's my take on that. And again, the fact that a racket has been erected around infectious disease makes it very difficult for any competing scientific findings to survive for long. And so this is part of the problem. So it's like they have all the ammo. Huh. Any scientist who dares challenge it can consider their career over, this kind of stuff. And so, yeah, it's a dictatorship. And this is, oh yeah, when science becomes, subjected to economic dictatorships, and the science gets very corrupt. And so I think that we're not going to get to the bottom of that. And until like those microscopes by Rice and DeSantis become used by all scientists, et cetera, I don't think we're going to get to the bottom of these issues. And so we'll see what happens. In the fifth epoch, again, already infectious disease was a non-issue in the West. And so, yeah, I think the whole infectious disease issue is going to go away in the fifth epoch. And what might survive will be trivial. Again, nobody's going to die from it, this kind of thing. So COVID, so let me get into COVID a bit. So my take on COVID is that it likely came out of a lab there in China. But if people are metabolically healthy, almost nobody would have died. So in the United States, the only people who died were old and fat. So with terrible metabolisms. And so if people were metabolically healthy, nobody would have died. My wife, in fact, gave me COVID twice, 2 years in a row. She went on a cruise, and she came back and gave it to me. I got the day she got home, she got sick, and the next day I got sick. It happened 2 years in a row. But and upper respiratory illnesses are the only kind that I ever get. But a few days of fasting, lying in bed with a fever, and it's over. And so yeah, so it's no big deal. I hadn't been sick for a decade when my wife brought it home a couple times. So, but again, I just fast, stay in bed, and get a fever, and it's soon over. Yeah, and I hadn't been sick in 10 years. My wife brought home COVID, and I haven't been sick in the years since then. So I rarely am ill. And for me, the wake-up call for me really was the draconian response to COVID. That really began to tell me something was wrong. All the lockdowns, again, the mandatory masking, all this kind of stuff. And that's when I really started going, oh, something's wrong with this picture. And in the years since then, it's been demonstrated quite clearly, I think, that there were no good scientific reasons for those responses. Yeah, and a wrecked American society. In fact, societies around the world were wrecked by this. I mean, children got developmental problems. They didn't go to school for a year. All this kind of. I mean, it was a catastrophe. So it was the response that was a catastrophe, not really COVID itself, which I'll get into more in this post. And there were early treatments that worked great. Ivermectin. Yeah, there were several treatments that worked great, and they were all wiped out fraudulently because they couldn't be patented. There couldn't be this big windfall for big pharma with these treatments that are already patented and their patents expired. And so they were forbidden treatments. Yeah, that was a big tell when all these treatments started being forbidden and banned, which was totally illegal, totally contrary to medical practice. We saw a bunch of new things happen in medicine that had never been seen before. Yeah, big pharma is not supposed to, and the medical authorities are not supposed to come between the doctors and their patients. And off-label prescription of ivermectin was totally fine, but it totally got banned to make way for the patented treatments. Uh, 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 Basically, mRNA vaccines and some drugs that Bill Gates was invested in, et cetera. And so they were all fraudulently tested and approved. And not only that, but the mRNA vaccines, they maimed and killed millions of people, and it's all been covered up. But the face of the pandemic were vaccine evangelists such as Bill Gates and Anthony Fauci, who had prodigious conflicts of interest. Yeah, these guys profited greatly from this, and they became the face of the pandemic response. So, and then really, when I read Robert Kennedy's masterpiece, The Real Anthony Fauci, that was my biggest single wake-up call. And I remember I had seen advance notice of this book several months before it came out, and I eagerly waited for it, and I was not disappointed. So that was really my big wake-up call on not only COVID, but basically the infectious disease racket that had been built while I was sleeping. Yeah, I really had not followed how it became a racket like it did with Fauci at the helm. So one of my college roommates was crippled by the COVID vaccine. I mean, there's no argument that he was crippled by the COVID vaccine. And my other survivor roommate was likely killed by it. Got brain cancer. And then, in fact, my other survivor, the four of us who lived together when I was in college, the other one was killed by his cancer treatment back in 2007. So I'm the last man standing. And I hear about it, and I don't collect stories. In fact, my socials haven't worked for a living for a while, and my social circle I don't see a lot of people in my daily life, but I keep hearing about people who are crippled by the COVID vaccine all the time. And I'm not even trying to hear about him. Yeah, he was in a wheelchair 6 months after he got his booster. When in my circle was this? And then literally just a couple weeks ago, heard about a couple who were vaccine cheerleaders. So they're the whole shebang. They were first in line for every COVID vaccine and the boosters, and they just couldn't get enough vaccines until here about a month ago. and as a husband and wife team, and they eagerly got their vaccines, and it crippled both of them same time, right after they got their booster. So now they're questioning their faith. And so, and again, as I think I said in the previous post, a poll not too long ago shows that about a quarter of all Americans think they know somebody who was killed by the COVID vaccine. Again, it's all being covered up though, and this is what the media and the big pharma and the medical racket does. Yeah, so it's a silent Holocaust, not the first one, may not be the last one, but we'll see. And when I wrote about again these issues, when I published my first medical racket essay, first version, at least 25 years ago. There's many topics. As a comprehensivist, there's a whole bunch of topics I stay up on, which is fun. I really enjoyed. Most of them are fun to keep up on, or the latest developments, et cetera, latest scientific findings, these kind of things. And in 2009, I read Sherry Tenpenny's book on vaccines. I think it's called "Just Say No" or something to vaccines. And that was actually in her book is where I read for the first time that childhood vaccines were never tested against a placebo control group. That's the standard for all drug testing, but somehow childhood vaccines were exempt from having a placebo control group. In fact, then in 2015, I actually began a vaccine thread on my forum, and little did I know how prescient that would be. And so, and I've read more than a dozen books, usually by medical professionals, that challenge vaccination. And not only do they challenge vaccination on the myth that they actually conquered diseases, which there's no evidence that they did, but the other thing they challenge them on is vaccine safety. So again, vaccines are never given credible safety testing. And so, and again, in my accompanying post, I linked to some of the best books most influential books I read on these topics, written by MDs. Yeah, this isn't some lunatic fringe stuff. And in fact, last year I summarized a chapter of one of them, a book called Dissolving Illusions, and it was a chapter on measles. Summarized one of the chapter there was on measles because there was all this media hysteria last year over an outbreak of measles in Texas. And my favorite vaccine statistic is that the measles death rate in England, in fact, I learned it from Dissolving Illusions, those authors, the measles death rate in England declined between 1840 when it peaked and 1960, which was years before the vaccine was ever introduced. The vaccine death rate, the measles death rate in England declined by 99.96%. Yeah. So it was total complete. Nobody died of measles in England when the vaccine was introduced. But the medical racket to this day, you'll hear all this, vaccines conquered measles. It's a big lie. Yeah, in fact, and again, I did it in I think my original post in this series on the medical racket were Aaron Siri. In fact, I'll discuss his book a little bit in this post. I'll do a much better summary in the future. Again, I think it was last year because of that outbreak. There was an MD that Siri knew who, knew what Siri did because Siri represented an organization that would basically sue the government to get vaccine data from the government, which the government just has this death grip on and won't let go of it because it shows vaccines aren't safe. Duh. And this doctor, started spouting out that vaccines conquered measles, and then Siri, then he responded to this guy because they known each other for a long time, but they stayed out of each other's face on this. But when he said that, then Siri said, okay, well, in the United States, the vaccine death rate between 1900 and 1962, which is the year before the measles vaccine was approved in the United States, the death rate declined by 98%. And Siri said, so what caused the decline? And this doctor goes, vaccines. And Siri's like, okay, I don't think you heard me. If the death rate went down by 98% between 1900 and 1962 in the United States, before there was a vaccine for measles, what caused it? And the doctor goes, vaccines did it. Yeah, that's so Siri had to say it for the third time before it finally sank in with this MD. Now all I could do is parrot the propaganda. He was incapable of rational discussion of this issue, which is common. This is well, in fact, my post yesterday on how the rackets work, and 70% of medical professionals are oblivious to the racket they're in. And that was an example of how oblivious medical professionals are to the reality of the racket they work in. And so, anyway, so the medical racket credits vaccines with conquering measles, and outbreaks cause hysteria. Well, what's wrong with that picture? I had it as a kid, and nobody died of measles when I was a kid. Yeah, in fact, big pharma and the medical racketeers and their mouthpieces try to say that, well, like 1 out of several hundred children died of measles back then. That's not true at all. More like about 1 in 8,000. And that 1 in 8,000, I'm sure that one was already in ill health. A healthy child had nothing to fear from measles. In fact, a healthy child had nothing to fear from COVID. The CDC was unable to find one previously healthy child in the United States who died of COVID. Yeah, believe it or not. Yeah, children didn't die of. They didn't. No, not one previously healthy child died of COVID in the United States. But we inject them with the vaccines, which has killed millions. And what's wrong with that picture? So, and then not only do vaccine never conquer any diseases, particularly the deadly ones, the racketeers claim vaccines test for a disease that probably wasn't even infectious at all, which is polio. Yes, the evidence is very strong that polio is a chemical poisoning disease. It's not caused by the polio virus. And so this is the only instance like this of where a chemical poisoning disease gets blamed on a virus. AIDS is another one. Yeah, so AIDS is almost certainly also a chemical poisoning disease and not caused by the HIV virus. In fact, when I wrote my original medical record essay, I wrote that Peter Duesberg challenged AIDS orthodoxy and had his career ruined, in fact, by Anthony Fauci because of it. But I didn't really have to study it that much until I read about Kennedy devoted several chapters to it in his book. And then I read Celia Farber's work on this. In fact, wrecked her career publishing the book. And so AIDS was caused by drug users. All the early AIDS patients were heavy drug users. And the gay people, they all did poppers, which is this anal sex drug and stuff. And so it was drug users to get AIDS. Yeah, there was never again. Oh, there was all these amazing predictions that humanity go extinct and all this kind of stuff. This pandemic would sweep the world, and in fact, Fauci started to have casual contact with transfer AIDS and stuff. And there was never any AIDS epidemic, was there? In fact, what's happening in Africa, they call it an AIDS epidemic. It's not at all. That's a big lie. And so this is, and I've written on the subject quite a bit. And so, actually last year I had the pleasure of meeting Vera Sharav, who was a Holocaust survivor and featured in Kennedy's and Farber's books. And so that was a pleasure to meet Vera. And so, I'm a fan of hers. And polio is just one of many times that industrial chemicals and pollutants have their harms covered up, either by blaming germs for it or having scientists in the pay of industrial interests cover it all up. Yeah, so the first polio outbreak was actually it happened in a town in Vermont when the same summer that they started using this miracle pesticide called lead arsenate. This new miracle pesticide, and they just everybody was spraying all over the place, and all of a sudden it was the first polio outbreak was then, and nobody put it together. Amazingly, nobody put it together, and so everybody, and this was the germ theory disease is pretty new, so there was this dogged search to hunt for the germ that was responsible for polio when it was really caused by this insecticide. And in fact, after 40 years, they finally started phasing out lead arsenate after it was defended by all these industrial scientists. Yeah, this was normal back then. All these toxic chemicals are defended by scientists who actually work for the companies that make them, and they became these authorities on the subject. Yeah, talk about corrupt science. Yes. Again, that's why biomedical science today is considered the flimsiest and most corrupt branch of science. These kind of examples are why it's considered so flimsy and corrupt, because it is flimsy and corrupt. And then after they phased out lead arsenate back there in the 30s, then DDT became the new miracle insecticide, and then polio took off once again. And in fact, it peaked in the early 50s. And then by the time the ballyhooed polio vaccines, which was the first national vaccine campaign was for polio had already disappeared by the time the campaign came out, because farmers stopped using DDT because the insects that it was supposed to kill became immune to it. So they stopped using DDT. So DDT was phased out by the time the polio vaccine came out, and polio coincidentally disappeared at the same time before there was ever a vaccine for it. You will not see that in the standard books on the wonders of vaccines. Yeah, ask Paul Offit about that, and it'll have a conniption. And so, but the same year, all that was going on, of looking, calling polio caused by the polio virus, and all these barbaric treatments and stuff to come up with these worthless vaccines. Scientists were covering up the harm of lead. So in the 20s, it got put into gasoline purely for profit reasons. Yeah, today we don't have lead in our gasoline today. We didn't need it back then, but it turned out they could patent it and make money off tetraethyl lead. It wasn't phased out till the 1990s, but there was all these scientists who were in the pay of the lead polluters that defended it. Oh, that's fine. It's good. Have some for breakfast. I mean, this was the so-called science of the day, and And so, in fact, the same years, the fluoride ion was a hazardous waste byproduct of industry, particularly aluminum refining. And scientists who worked for the fluoride polluters were able to invert reality and turn fluoride ion from a hazardous industrial waste into a tooth's best friend, a compulsory medicine, which is in my water today. Yeah. So the whole outrage around polio and the fraud around polio, it has good company. Back to the flimsiest and most corrupt branch of science. Yeah. So hazardous waste turned into compulsory medicine that's in my water, comes out of my tap today. In fact, I recently, series Vaccines, Amen. That was quite a read. And I hardly know where to start on it. And I will summarize it at a later date. But the book clearly shows, as the title of the book says, there is this religious faith in the United States about vaccines. And it's completely unwarranted. I mean, it's just like there's no reason to have this crazy religious faith around vaccines. It's just another medical procedure. In fact, then again, Suri's book does it. In fact, all the books I've read in the past 20 years emphasizes that no childhood vaccine given to an American child has ever had credible safety testing performed for it, namely a control group that was not vaccinated. And you can see Paul Offit and Peter Hotez and all these guys, you will watch them, they will shout to the rafters why that's fine, why it's okay to not have a control group, a valid control group for vaccine trials. It is the only medical product in the West that this is done for, that there's no control group, no valid control group. Yeah, in fact, probably the most damning statistic that I saw in Suri's book was that for many of the vaccine trials, so the trials exist, and again, even though there's no placebo control group, you still get data from the trials themselves. And for many of the trials, there are they recorded serious adverse events in more than 10% of the patients. And a serious adverse event means a trip to the emergency room or they die. So at least 10% of the experimental subjects in these vaccine trials had serious adverse events, which meant they almost died or did die, or were crippled permanently. And according to the vaccine scientists, that qualifies as a safe vaccine. Yeah. So it's called safe. And then other vaccines, because, and again, the total fraudulence of the testing, they'll test other vaccines, and if their adverse rate is similar to the other one, so they have a 10% adverse rate, then they're also safe. They don't, yeah. Unreal. Yeah, unreal. So 10% serious, these are serious adverse events, which means their lives are never the same. 10% of the children would have serious adverse events, and they would dub these vaccines to be safe. Yeah, believe it or not. No wonder they won't compare vaccinated subjects versus an unvaccinated population. And in fact, the last chapter of Suri's book was about a study that he actually got pro-vaccine scientists to make for the patients of Henry Ford Health, so a private health organization there in the Midwest. And because the American government never makes its data available, so the data, and the government has this data, they will not publish this data because they know what the answer is. And so, but he was able to get some scientists who are actually pro-vaccine scientists to do a study there at Henry Ford Health. They had millions of patients. And so, and those scientists are actually hoping to prove how healthy vaccinated children were. They went in thinking that was going to be the case. How to say it? Suri may have deceived them, because I think Suri knew what the answer would be. But anyway, so they did the study, though. So they did the study against, and again, there are unvaccinated, there's about 1% of American children who never got vaccinated. And so anyway, so the Henry Ford Health, there were like over 1,000, there were well over 1,000 children there who weren't vaccinated, and there were like, I think 15,000 who were or something in this study. And anyway, it was statistically valid. And big populations. And in fact, it's one of the only studies ever done. In fact, the only one that Suri knows of like this that was actually comparing truly vaccinated versus unvaccinated populations. And the results couldn't have surprised Suri much. It surprised the scientists who performed the study, which was that the vaccinated population had an average of 2.5 times more chronic conditions than the unvaccinated population. And that actually understates the case. So for several of the chronic conditions and adverse events, chronic conditions that the vaccinated population had, they didn't find one case in the unvaccinated population. So the denominator was zero. So they couldn't come up with a statistic for that. Yeah. So again, Kennedy's book writes about it, and I've seen the number basically children with chronic conditions before the 1986 law, gave a shielding of liability for big pharma. About 10% of children had chronic conditions, and my guess is that all comes from processed food. And then, but since the 1986 law, which shielded big pharma from vaccine liability, from harms to the children who get vaccinated, the rate is over half. So over half of children have chronic conditions. And I see it all the time in my family. So children who got vaccinated, they're physical wrecks with chronic diseases, chronic conditions. And I've seen asthma, eczema, peanut allergies, again, immune system disorders, all this stuff. And as again, these kids got pincushion with vaccines growing up. And so, yeah, they have conditions that were unknown when I was a kid. Again, autism was, and that's Siri did a big one on autism. That's the sort of big hot button with the vaccine promoters, is that there's no connection. That's a big lie. And so, and all sorts of neurological conditions. So, neurological damage. Yeah. So what I've seen, in fact, the COVID vaccine was very similar. So neurological and circulatory damage, those are the two big ones. And so vaccines in general have those kind of effects. And so, yeah, in fact, the 1986 law, which shielded big pharma because they were getting their butts sued off, the actual law said that vaccines are unavoidably unsafe. That was a rationale for the shield law. And so all we hear today, though, is safe and effective. This mantra is safe and effective. Where'd that come from? When unavoidably unsafe was the wording of the law when they exempted big pharma from vaccine lawsuits. Yeah, that's a deal the mafia envies. So yeah, they can. In fact, that Siri's whole book was about big pharma has no incentive to make their vaccines safe because they're shielded from liability. Yeah, and there's no other product in medicine like that. There's nothing else that has this, and it's the elephant in the room that vaccine promoters just can't seem to see. Yeah, a lot of them see it quite well, and they know what they're doing. But most people just, again, they're oblivious. Most medical professionals like that doctor kept parroting that vaccines were conquered measles. Yeah, just their brains are just shut off. All they can do is recite the catechisms they were raised with. Well, anyway, so at Ford Family Health, those scientists, those pro-vaccine scientists, then came up with these results. They refused to publish the study. They were afraid of losing their jobs and careers if they actually published the study. But Siri had it, and he excerpted it in the book. So yeah, so this is when the wrong answer comes up, it'll never see the light of day, unless somebody like again a great attorney like Siri though has brought this to light. So this is. Anthony Fauci, for his part, made his initial claim to fame by embracing the bogus HIV model of AIDS. In fact, AZT was deadly. AZT killed thousands of healthy gay men who were diagnosed with HIV positive, but that didn't mean they would get AIDS. Yeah, HIV does not cause AIDS. And so it has maybe some relationship to it, but it's not the cause. And so, but AZT killed about 300,000 gay men in the United States who were previously healthy, and they started taking AZT and they died because AZT is deadly. It was an abandoned chemotherapy drug because it was so deadly, but it got rebranded as the only treatment for HIV or for AIDS. In fact, Nisanza's treatment, it reversed AIDS. And so, yeah, understandably, you get it. So it's an immune system failure caused by chemicals. And so rehabilitate the immune system and AIDS goes away instead of giving them this horrific drug, which again killed off about 300,000 gay men in the United States. The Holocaust of gay men. And after the AIDS catastrophe, every few years, Fauci and his minions would come up with these infectious disease scares. Every few years, there'd be another disease scare, Zika. I mean, there's a bunch of them. And until he hit COVID, until he hit pay dirt with COVID. In fact, a lawsuit unearthed this email where there was, and I published it. I linked to it in the company post. Somebody there in Fauci's organization made a kind of a joke out of it as an NCAA like playoff chart brackets, and it was all these again fake disease scares, infectious disease scares until COVID was the winner. Yeah, I'm not kidding. There were something like a dozen infectious disease scares, which were all bogus. Again, to justify vaccines and this kind of stuff. So what I was kind of unaware of, kind of oblivious to really, even when I wrote my first medical essay, was that there was this infectious disease racket that had formed. And it's one of the greatest on earth today. And so Bill Gates, man, he wants to vaccinate the world and stuff. And it's just like, and when he kills off 10 times as many African girls as the ones who got vaccinated, the ones unvaccinated girls, I'm sorry, the vaccinated girls had a death rate 10 times the unvaccinated girls, then Gates moved to suppress all those findings and stuff. So he knows what he's doing. and so forced injections are part of the bag of tricks, mandatory vaccine campaigns, which are not far removed from what the Nazis did. In fact, the whole Nuremberg laws and stuff came out of what the Nazis did, and people should not be forced to have medical procedures, except mandatory vaccines are forced medical procedures. In fact, for all the immense crimes of the Trump administration, which I'll write about more in the future, in fact, attacking Iran is the latest outrage on this. I really hope that Robert Kennedy Jr. can do something where I'm not subjected to a mandatory vaccination in my lifetime again. So we'll see. I wish Kennedy the best on that. And even though a lot of what Trump is doing, it's retail politics is not the answer. But if Kennedy can make us where I'm not subjected to mandatory vaccination again, I'll hoist a toast to him. But anyway, so that's all I have for now.